Hey everybody, good to see you. Welcome back. We're going to be commenting a little bit on this week's Torah portion, which is called Terumah, and that's going to be found in the book of Exodus or Shmot, starting at chapter 25, verse 1 through 27:19. And I always enjoy really getting into this subject matter. I've always found it interesting. I mean, from the time that I discovered it or was exposed to it. Um, One of the things that is interesting when we put this kind of in context of when you begin to kind of analyze and think about subject matter and how much space and time is given to subject matter, because, and then you think about how people, YouTube videos or teachers or whatever, how much time they spend on a subject as opposed to the amount of space that the Bible itself spends on various topics and subjects. And I've talked before how that in the book of Genesis, when we think about that, if you, I suspect if you did the man on the street thing and you took a poll or something, you asked people, what is the main topic of the book of Genesis? That probably most people would say that the main topic is about creation, when in reality, only a couple of chapters are devoted to that subject matter. Whereas in reality, if we begin to, the scripture quickly begins to focus upon different people, focuses upon Noah, and we get to know him a little bit, but we get to know Abraham much better. And then even we get more as it goes, like Jacob particularly, we get more insight into his personality and character, and then especially Joseph. Most of Genesis is Joseph gets most of the space, most of the face time in the book of Genesis. And when we look at Exodus or even the rest of the Torah, most of I think it'd be interesting to see a breakdown of it, but most of the book of Exodus, I would say, as well as the Torah overall, is devoted in some way or another to the subject of the tabernacle or the Mishkan. And so it's kind of interesting when you think about that. If that's true, then if Joseph and the tabernacle are two of the main subjects of the Torah, then that they must be pretty important, especially in light of so many passages that, for example, the book of Hebrews, quoting from Psalms, that says, "Behold, I come in the volume of the book; it is written of me to do your will," and that Yeshua saying, and starting with Moses and going through all of the prophets and the Psalms, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, essentially, he began to open their eyes and show them all the things written of himself. And so all of these things are giving us pictures of the Messiah in different ways, and other things too. It's not exclusively just talking about that subject matter, but you have anything you want to add thus far?
Not yet.
This particular Torah portion, Terumah, in Terumah, by the way, it's a type of offering, a free will offering, maybe translated as a heave or uplifting. Some of the translations, it will just merely be translated as portion, as it is in mine. They translated an English word, portion. And so it begins here in chapter 25 of Exodus by saying, Hashem spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and let them take for me a portion," or terumah. "From every man whose heart motivates him shall you take my portion." And this wasn't exclusively men, by the way, because later on the Torah takes specific note that about the women bringing their mirrors to donate them. They were made out of copper, polished. That's how they made coppers initially, was out of shiny metal that they polished up. And that's what we'll find out later. The kior, or the copper laver, was made out of the mirrors of women. And I've talked about that subject before, which is an interesting theme and concept to get into, and maybe we will, on the concept of mirrors and that hopefully we'll talk about in the future. So anyone whose heart motivated them, it says, was free, and encouraged to bring a gift to donate for the tabernacle. And then it's going to proceed to, and again, this wasn't obligatory, was not mandatory. If you don't want to donate, you don't have to donate, and you shouldn't. If you're not moved to do it, then it's not for you to contribute to. But starting in verse 3, it outlines the types of materials that are acceptable for this project. And it says, gold, silver, and copper, turquoise, purple, and scarlet wool, linen, and goat hair, red dyed ram skins, takash skins, acacia wood, oil for illumination, spices for the anointment oil, and the aromatic incense, shoham stones and stones for the setting, for the ephod and the breastplate. And then in verse 8 it says, they shall make a sanctuary for me, or a mikdash, so that I may dwell among them. Like everything that I show you, the form of the tabernacle and the form of the vessels, so shall you do. And so take note that he didn't say, make a sanctuary for me that I might dwell in it, but he said, make a sanctuary for me that I might dwell among them, among the people. And in the New Testament, I think in a passage, they even interpreted and quoted as to make a tabernacle, a sanctuary that I might dwell in them. And so it gives us these, according to Rashi, the Jewish commentator, a list of 13 different categories of materials, of metals and of fabrics and of oils and spices and things and stones. And I think I've essentially hit on most of it, but there's actually more things than that are mentioned there. But Rashi says there's 13 categories. And so we looked at this, and we've talked about the number 13 before, and it's interesting, especially in light of this, because in the West, typically the number 13 has a negative connotation to it, but in the scripture, that's, well, every letter, every number, every symbol, everything has both a light and shadow side to it, just like pretty much nearly any object, like a computer, a camera, a gun, a car, can be used for good or bad. The gun is not bad. The camera, the internet, it's good things can be used with it, or bad things, depending upon the motivation and intention and agenda of the people using the things. And so the number 13, we will see in the book of Exodus a little bit later, that there are 13 characteristics or attributes of mercy attributed to God that we will see at that time. The word love, ahava, has a numerical value of 13, and so it's interesting, like in 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, and you'll see this connection often with these themes of love in the number 13, as well as the concept of unity or oneness, because the Hebrew word for oneness, unity, echad, has a numerical value of 13, as in, like the Shema of Deuteronomy 6:4. And so, which this passage, this narrative, tells us in a number of cases to do it this way so that the tabernacle, the Mishkan, may become one. And so all of these things ultimately are designed to bring about oneness. And so it's interesting, the connection with the concept of oneness and the 13, that is used to bring that out or bring that about. We also talked earlier about the tribes. We often refer to the 12 tribes of Israel, but really, usually there's more than that. they're called the 12 tribes of Israel because one of them is going to be set apart. Levi is set apart, and he's not even counted with the rest of the tribes. After, he probably was at first, but once Levi is chosen, from which the priesthood will come from, he is not counted in the census along with the rest of the tribes of Israel. And so, in many ways, we could think about Levi as the 13th tribe, like in the encampments around the tabernacle, as we'll see more so a little bit later on, particularly in the book of Numbers, that Levi sort of serves as a buffer around the Mishkan or tabernacle between God and the rest of the tribes of Israel. And not only a buffer, but Levi's name, if you remember Leah, when she had Levi, her third son, uh, she said, now my husband will be enjoined unto me or attached to me. And so that is the meaning of Levi or Levi, this idea of connecting and attaching and enjoining to. And so it seems that Levi has this function of bringing about a unity of from a multiplicity or a diversity of different people, that Levi has to be able to connect with a diverse group, with each of those tribes, and as different as they all are, and somehow he forms a buffer and a catalyst, I think, to help them all be unified.
Well, and I think if Levi's doing his job properly, he's taking his cues as a tribe from the standards of Yahweh. He's meant to be the teacher of them, to teach the teachings that were transmitted to Moses. And so, kind of like in a light bulb, you talk about the positive and the negative doohickeys
Charge.
that are in there, and then there's a net neutral filament.
Right.
And so, Levi, to me, when he's doing his job properly, you see in Genesis where, as a tribe, he joined himself with Simeon in the retribution and vengeance of the mistreatment of their sister Dinah, and they slaughtered a town, a village. And then at the end of Genesis, there's a prophecy that says, fierce was their anger, and I'll separate them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. And there's a fierce, all in kind of quality that's very, almost zealous, like a zealot, that Levi has in order to do what he did at the sin of the golden calf, where his eye didn't pity and he didn't spare. He, in righteousness, judged the sin of idolatry in the nation. And when Levi is attached or joined to God and is doing correctly there and teaching the rest of the tribes, I think that provides the basis for all the diversity to come together with the same goal and the same set of regulations and law of how they are to behave as a nation.
Right. That's true. Well, and yeah, once again, I mean, I was thinking about like in the book of Numbers, and maybe we'll do a video on it when it that Torah portion comes up, but Bamidbar in the wilderness, that we will see how the encampments of the tribes in the wilderness are going to be laid out, and that how that you have three tribes with each other, each direction, and how over or one of those tribes is a head tribe. And so, like to the east, Judah is a head tribe with, I think, Zebulun and Issachar, is that right? I think. And Reuben to the south is the head tribe. And then we have Ephraim to the west and Dan to the north. And so, to each of those directions, you have a head tribe. And, it's interesting that, and maybe we'll do a video on it sometime, related relating to the concept of the names of the directions, because each direction, I think particularly when you begin to look into the Hebrew names and things, each of those directions have a different energy to it, and which is somewhat reflective in the those tribes and the personalities of them. I mean, because,
Yeah.
well, for example, north, the Hebrew mindset and calendar is more um, Eastern centric, as you see in a lot of cases, that and God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and the people at Shinar, I think in Genesis 11, that are building the Tower of Babel, they moved. It says they moved away from the east, and so the east represents like the source and the sun, and it's the idea of facing toward the sun or facing the east. Usually, the some of the main words for east. North, for example, Saphon has to do with this idea of obscurity, gloominess, ambiguity, something mysterious or
Mystery.
unclear. And so
Yeah.
Dan, who is the head of that, is probably one of maybe the tribe shrouded in the greatest mystery, or definitely one of them of all of the tribes. And so, which when we get into this other stuff, and we start asking questions about these contributions of this Terumah offering, we're dealing with various types of elements, and so these are our subject matter. Now, usually it's viewed in a very thick, uh, narrow religious view, but when you look at all of this and what's actually going on, it's just interesting how these different elements are going to be used, and then later on, as we get into the talking about in Leviticus, the korbanot, or the offerings, all of these things come together essentially to create a field, a space time and sacred space and time field to unify everything, to create a connection between heaven and earth, and between the Most High God, the God of Israel, and His people. And so that is that's a lot of what this is about. Now, as to how it all happened, now a lot of people talk about how the symbolism, which hopefully we will have time to talk about a little bit, the symbolism of some of these things, but I don't believe it's just simply symbolic. I think that there were and are practical reasons why things are put together like they are, that God doesn't do anything in vain. And so if He says to take these various fabrics and weave them together with this little gold strand,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it actually does something. Maybe it's just not to be for aesthetics or
Yeah.
symbolism, but actually uh, create. Maybe this is a giant transistor of some kind. I think it's probably a lot of things. My guess would say that. I think also it probably is a, again, this is my opinion. I can't at this point prove this, but I think it's probably a grand prophetic calendar. I think that the tabernacle is probably a lot of things. Probably if we had the ability to interpret all of these things, there's probably lots of information embedded into the structure of the tabernacle and the furniture and everything else.
I agree. I agree with that because it was made after a pattern, a heavenly pattern, and we know that by a few different scriptures. Um, and so, this is just a whole Pandora's box of wonderfulness for me because
Mhm.
if you will recognize and align to divine pattern, divine law, divine anything from the divine realm as it comes down, you're going to experience the benefits and reap the benefits of divine blessing or whatever it is that you're doing that's in alignment, you're going to reap the benefits that come with being in alignment with the divine pattern. And so, sorry, I just kind of lost my train of
It's
thought.
okay.
Yeah.
It'll sound good.
So basically, yeah, that's what I was going to say. One thing that I think sin is, and the scripture says that sin's a lot of different things, but I think one of the, corrosive elements of sin is that it takes us away from hitting the mark of God's divine pattern. And then we reap the benefits or the drawbacks. We have the consequences of missing that mark. And to the degree that we miss that mark is to the degree that we have to live with the consequences of having sown chaos or corruption. And, especially in the world right now, with technology being what it is, and I get it, I understand. I like hearing about scientific breakthrough and technologies and all of that and what's possible. But I think in the arrogance of man thinking that they know better, there's just a lot of issues that come with that, because you can say, not to get off on a bunch of stuff, but you can say things like with the food, how we've genetically modified food. And then now, after 20 or 25 years of doing this, we've seen a whole slew of people develop autoimmune issues that, in many times and cases, can be linked straight back to consuming food that has been altered from the divine pattern, the natural pattern of creation. So I don't remember exactly what I was talking about. Oh, making it after the divine pattern. And the divine things actually, when we adhere to the divine pattern, the things of heaven and the kingdom of heaven actually have a way of coming down into the earth and affecting the earth and us in the way that it was meant to. So like the tabernacle, if they had said, well, I don't really see the point of this, and it's a lot of trouble, or I think this might work better, I don't think it would have worked.
No, it
No.
wouldn't have.
And
And that's hubris, and that's
it
like
is.
what you're talking about.
It is, and I mean, any little thing, it's an arrogance to say, because I don't understand it, must not have a function.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And I think that as a society, we've just gotten away, even believers have just gotten away from humbling themselves to the fact that not only is God God and He's perfect, He's got a divine order, and He's got reasons, specific reasons, for the things that He says to do that will benefit us and make us more like Him if we align to it. And so the tabernacle, with all of its furniture and all of its sockets and all of its bars and all of its coverings and all of that, like you said, all of those pieces and parts come together to work and affect a set apart time and space that He meets them in and affects them in, changes them through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and unfortunately, what you're talking about with the, it's unbelievable, the absolute hubris of mankind, and the scriptures, and even a lot of legends and literature over and over, from Pandora's box to Frankenstein.
Yeah.
There are these stories that highlight that, of the law of unintended consequences of people in their blind arrogance, not, there's so many science fiction stories
Yeah.
of The Fly or something,
Right.
that some little mistake is made, and you have catastrophe and chaos break out because of it.
If it's a mistake.
Yeah, right. But when you look at this understanding, and the scripture, one of the scriptures that Julie was referencing, well, says in Exodus 25:9 in our Torah portion, it says that according to all that I show you, after the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all the instruments thereof, even so shall you make it. In Hebrews chapter 8 verse 5, it says, who serve unto the example, and it's talking about the priesthood and such, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that you make all things according to the pattern showed to you on the mount. And a lot of, I would say, probably most people on the earth, and including Christians, which what I think, and whatever you call yourself, Messianic Christians, many are living and in their thinking and behavior perpendicular
Yes.
to the, to put it mildly, in many cases, in absolute opposition to the principles, commandments, guidelines, and structure and DNA of God, of His plan, His patterns, and so like here we're seeing that there's different types of metals and fabrics and woods that are to be used in this to bring about this set apart space time, and so I'm reminded, like I've had experiences before. For example, like some of you, I'm sure most of you are, many of you, in the book of Daniel, that there is this image that Nebuchadnezzar has this dream about this famous image that with the head of gold and the chest and the shoulders of silver, in the belly of copper and or brass, and the legs of iron, and the feet and toes made of iron mixed with miry clay. And so you've got these, particularly the feet, but some of these metals mixed together that are probably, it's not kosher. Like in the scripture, we're told that you shall not yoke an ox and a donkey together, for its confusion. You've got two different energies. If you yoke or couple those things together, you're going to end up with a disaster. You're going to end up with chaos and contention and a struggle, and two energies with completely different agendas that are never going to be in unity. And so, again, the New Testament says not to be unequally yoked, and he's drawing upon this principle that was actually talking about animals, but it's a bigger principle than even that. It says that you shouldn't wear a garment of linen and wool mixed together, a similar thing. And I've talked on that subject before, how, as Nikolai Tesla says, if you want to understand the universe, think in terms of frequency, energy, and vibration. And so everything has those things. And so wool and linen operate opposite one another, much in the same way. In the springtime, often in this part of the world, we have the warm and moist air masses rise up from the south and move toward the north, and they collide with cool, dry air masses from the north, and it creates a vortex of chaos and destruction. And that's what happens a lot of times when you mix things. Julie referred to the genetically modified seeds. It's no accident that a lot of these subjects and social controversies, if you want to say that, of our time have to do transgenderism, transhumanism, moving toward hybrid human beings, mixing, manipulating food and in medicine, and some of you know what I'm talking about there. But these medicines and remedies that are a mixture of man-made things and genetically, what's the word I'm looking for? Essentially like nanobots and things like that, that are two things that are being mixed together that are not kosher. And so many of the issues of our time, probably more than ever before, are man in his arrogance and his blindness. It says in Hosea that my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, and then you got to define knowledge and
Sure.
see how the scripture defines these things. There are things that are supposed to be
Yes.
blended and synthesized, like we've talked about. Julie referenced the light bulb, how you have a negative charge in the light bulb and a positive charge, but then the neutral filament that sort of synthesizes and holds in balance those powers, or male and female. And there's lots of things in the scriptures that are synthesized in such a way. But if you don't understand that or conform it, or if God is saying, use these types of things. Now, I do want to mention this in case, and many people may not have noticed, but I said that linen and wool are not to be mixed together. There is an exception when it comes to the tabernacle and the garments of the high priest. Now, it has some other things. It's not just, let me see here, turquoise, and that's going to be techelet, kind of a techelet blue, purple and scarlet wool, linen, white linen, and goat hair. And also, I don't think it says here, but there is a little, like a wire of gold sewed into a lot of these things too. So maybe having those other things, I'm just guessing here, maybe turns that potential toward chaos and destruction into a positive power, perhaps. But
Well, and mixtures aren't necessarily a problem. I mean, that's what all great recipes are, mixtures, and it either works or it doesn't. And I think that's the proof. If creation continues to operate the way it was set up, and I mean, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but when you pan back and you look at something that's introduced, there are certain things that can really be helpful. And there have been things down through the history of the world that help with different ailments and stuff. But just in my lifetime, like just the commercials of some of these medicines, used to, I mean, it would make a good Saturday Night Live skit.
yeah,
I mean, things that, if you've taken this and your eyeball fell out and rolled 6 miles and, all these crazy things would sound like a skit with Saturday Night Live. But I mean, now if you get commercials, you have cable, you see as a matter of regular course these commercials that run like that, because these medicines are really causing problems for people. And so, it's not that I'm against helping people or anything, but the principles, mankind just has a way, as when they start to do this and they start to get too smart for their own good, they have a way of fragmenting and compartmentalizing all these areas of life and saying, well, with this one thing we'll try this, and it doesn't work well, but it's just with this one thing. But what they don't understand is that it's an ecosystem. There's a spiritual ecosystem, and as well as any other kind of ecosystem. And when you start genetically modifying the food, and that causes problems, and then you start doing certain things with mixing things that you're giving people to take for ailments, then that causes problems. And it's not done, I don't think it's done intentionally. I mean, I think that the people that genetically modified the food thought, if we can fix issues with the food, we can enhance shelf life so that we can actually get more food to the places it needs to go to. We can grow food in off season, which will help feed more people. I mean, I think that the motive behind it is often good, but you pay the price when you cross the pattern of a divine nature, and I would say creation also, because creation's different than the world that we build. Creation was already here, and even if you don't believe in God, even if you don't, and you believe in evolution or you're an atheist or whatever, then count to me, you just chalk it up to nature has had a long, long time to get really smart about what works and what doesn't for it. And when we start trying to improve on nature with our short term perspective on things, then often that law of unintended consequences begins. We start reaping the benefit of that. And I think at the bottom or the base of it is this idea that we're going to improve on things. And there are a lot of problems in the world or whatever, but if you had the viewpoint of God outside of time and space and you pan back, then a lot of maybe what we're calling problems, in the grand scheme of things, there's a purpose and a reason, and it'll work. And I'm not saying everybody's life always turns out perfectly, that's not what I'm saying, but the system of creation can perpetuate itself and not be annihilated or not really cause a lot of problems. I mean, even things we call disasters are kind of built-in safety mechanisms to help the earth and creation right itself. Like when electricity discharges out of the sky and strikes the earth, I mean, there's different benefits to that. It may cause a fire, and that's not good in the short term, but then over the long term, it actually clears out a lot of brush and helps the vegetation and all of that. And tectonic plates moving, earthquakes, it has to happen to where the way all that works releases tension in all of that, and it creates a disaster, and people can die and get injured, and so that's not good. But I mean, over the long term,
It's bad when you get injured after you die.
well, it's really bad. Nobody expects that.
No.
Well,
Adds insult to injury right there.
But insulted more than a wound.
Right.
Mortal wound. That's really a bummer. But I really do think that short term, we look at our life and we look at the world with such a short-sighted, short-term perspective and a very egocentric. I mean, nobody wants to suffer, and I understand that. And I mean, gosh, this could go into so many different areas. From, bullies, it's not a good idea. Like when you see kids and people being bullied, I'm not for that. I'm against it.
Really?
I
That's not
am.
what you told me earlier.
When I was beating on him. But it does. I mean, I think we all can look at things in our life when we were younger, and not just last week, where we were bullied or we had things happen to us and it was very unpleasant, and it wasn't just, and it shouldn't have happened in terms of the fact that it wasn't just. But suffering can cause growth in areas that you just wouldn't grow if you didn't suffer. And not that I'm advocating suffering, I'm advocating growth, and I'm advocating a process that, if left alone, with God to oversee it and us to be humble to the divine order, will produce over the long haul some pure metals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of people don't know it, or a lot of churches sure don't or don't want to. But suffering is actually can be kind of a blessing. Actually, I mean, it's not. It's. I didn't intend on talking about any of the subject matter today, but since that door has been open, I'll give you to substantiate what because that's kind of a pretty crazy statement. If you turn over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, it says, let's see, so that we ourselves glory in you in the churches of God for your patience and faith in all your persecutions and tribulations that you endure, which is a manifest token or sign, evidence, of the righteous judgment of God, that you may be counted worthy of the kingdom of God, for which you also suffer. And so that's pretty hardcore, and that
It
really
is.
goes against the grain of what the way people think. And I wanted to kind of add a little bit to what you were saying there of like is it wrong to try to improve things? No, if you do it using the proper blueprint and the prop after the pattern. But when we go off half cocked in our own limited scope and understanding and arrogance and don't know what could happen, what could be the result of for example, and I don't know. I'm not saying this. I'm obviously not a scientist or anyone, but I just know that often there are unintended
Mm-hmm.
consequences, and if you like genetically modified seeds and food and stuff like that, what do we really know what effect, not
Mm-hmm.
just people, but that might have on insects
Mm-hmm.
like bees or other
Right.
things? Who knows? And I'm not saying that there's a cause and effect there, but if you change one thing, there will be a
Yes.
cause and effect
Right.
somehow.
Yes.
And what this essentially, I know that they don't know what they're doing. They're not framing it in this
Mm-hmm.
way, but essentially, a lot of these things are to an attempt to bypass curses of God, which
Right.
were brought about from doing things not according to his pattern in the first place. And so you end up with these consequences of curses as opposed to blessings. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but it's interesting, to sort of think about these because most people haven't really ever thought about these things conceptually or etymologically of the differences between the nature of blessings and curses and that sort of thing. That simply put, when you think about a curse, it sort of connotes scarcity and lack and this sort of thing. Other things too, chaos and destruction, death and destruction, and all kinds of horrible things. Blessing, on the other hand, which is you've got your prosperity people and all that, and there is some biblical basis for that. It's been distorted to an extreme with certain groups, but essentially, when you're talking about cursing, lack, restriction, uh, barrenness, blessing, you're talking about flow. You're talking about a flow of life and energy and movement in a good thing. And so, it's interesting we're looking at this situation. That's what we're sort of, the Israelites were given these plans, these blueprints, this uh, tafnit, I believe, is the Hebrew. Um, some translations, I'm trying to think, form or forms is the word that's used. And you set this thing up in such a way so that so there can be a connection in relationship and a flow of energy back and forth from heaven to earth, and that God's power and energy and presence can flow into the lives of his people, and that is blessing, that is prosperity. Even if you have suffering and problems and stuff, it still is a flow. And no, there's not just flow and goodness and unicorns and sunshine and all of that all the time. Struggles, as Julie said, are part of it, but we don't want them to be self-inflicted and
Right.
self-sabotage and doing stupid things that could be prevented.
Well, or ignorant.
Yeah.
Just ignorant things, ignorant of the law. And I
Hmm.
mean, I'm not even just talking about the Torah here. I'm talking about any universal law,
Hmm.
cause and effect.
Hmm.
I mean, whatsoever you sow, you reap.
Hmm.
There's, it's, people always talk about, like when you start talking about law and you start talking about curses or being cursed or being in chaos or whatever, People get offended sometimes. It's like, well, I don't really want to serve a God that puts curses on people. Well, kind of by the same token, do you want to live in a city where the judge doesn't ever make judgments in a case for what's right? I mean, and you might say, well, that's not the same thing. A lot of the things that work in our lives when we get perpendicular to the divine law that work as curses are not really, they can be, but they're just consequences of choosing to go against the thing that works. And so you can say, well, an angry God, an angry God. Well, I don't think that that's always honest, because if you're looking at laws working or not working, if you cross the law of electricity and you go touch a live wire, we don't think in terms of electricity being angry. It's just the law. There's a law there that works, and you either know the law and you obey the law that governs electricity or any other force in this world, or you pay the price for it. We understand when it comes to things like that in our practical life and environment, and we don't get mad and call the electric company and scream and demand why. I mean, unless they didn't do something correctly. But we all just understand you don't go sticking your finger or a fork or whatever, safety pin, in a live, whatever the problem would be, light socket, and then...
What about a spoon?
I don't know, it might do better. It depends on what metal it's made out of. I don't know, maybe it doesn't. Maybe a plastic spoon would work. I don't know.
Don't try this at home.
No, in any case. But I mean, there's such a disconnect with when we understand a law and it works against us, we don't get accusing. We may not like the outcome. But when it's a mystical law or a divine law that we don't understand, then we get mad at God, or we say that God is an angry God. Why does he have to be angry to be just? Any more than the judge has to be angry to render a verdict according to the law, or electricity to kill you or not kill you based on the law that governs that. I mean, there's a difference, and I see a very big difference, and it calls for discernment and it calls for knowledge, and the right kind of knowledge. But there's a big difference in letting corrupt officials dictate how things are going to be. And they can make laws, but those laws are inferior because they're not based on what's right. There's a difference in wanting to seek liberation and to free yourself from authority figures who are corrupt and enacting their own agendas over you. There's a difference between that and the God of the universe, who has set all of this in motion for its eventual good, for its goodness and its correctness and the unfolding of the kingdom of heaven on earth. And men may not like it, and I understand that, because I don't think anybody can read the Bible. There's going to be parts that we're all going to like and parts that we're not going to like. And to the degree that we come into alignment with all of it is to the degree that we experience the benefits of being aligned to divine law. It's just a fact. It's a fact. It's inescapable. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not in the law of cause and effect. If you go steal a car and you get jacked up on heroin and you go drive into some whatever, or reverse, and go drive off into somebody's front living room and you kill their dog, and all kinds of craziness ensues, you're going to pay the penalty in some way, shape, or form for making that choice. And that's not the result of an angry God. That's not narrow thinking. That is just, you made that choice, now that's the consequence. And I think that's one of the biggest issues facing the world today, is that people will not accept the fact that there is divine law and order that governs all of this, no matter what you believe or think or say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's what happened in the garden, essentially, that everybody passed the buck. Nobody took personal responsibility, and they blamed somebody else, is how it started out. And that's the same. I was thinking about your scenario of the guy running jacked up on heroin, whatever that means.
He's messed up. I
Yeah.
don't know. Whatever.
Usually that, yeah, they
I don't
pass.
know. You get it.
But yeah, that a lot of people would blame the criminal justice system, or something for his problems or
the
society.
drug dealer for giving them bad crap or what. I mean,
Yeah,
it's always somebody else's fault.
yeah, exactly. There's there's so much to to get to. We actually did a video earlier, and we had a problem with the sound. And there's a lot. It was really good, I think. A lot of good subject matter that we covered that we haven't covered in this. We covered some different things here, but it's interesting to sometimes look at just compare and contrast. Like the tabernacle, I mentioned the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden had three parts. I mean, there's a number of tabernacles and temples that down through the ages, and the Garden of Eden being the first one was a temple, which says God planted a garden eastward. So there's a garden, there's a designate within Eden. So there's a place called Eden, and then to the east section of Eden there's a garden, and then it refers to in the midst of the garden. So there's some distinction with that there. Noah's Ark that we read about not too terribly long ago, it had three sections to it, and Noah had three sons that were to fill the nations: Shem, Japheth, and Ham. The In the New Testament, and I was reading Josephus the other day, and he echoed this: the Apostle Paul's assessment of spirit, soul, and body, of three major sections of making up the human being. And so we see this pattern of, like with the tabernacle or temples, of the outer court, the holy place or inner court, and the holy of holies, the small thing corresponding like spirit, soul, and body. And earlier we did talk about the biological nature of etymologically and thematically with a lot of these things. When you look at the Hebrew, there's references to things like head and feet and rib and side and all of this regarding this the furniture and stuff. I find it interesting, when you starting out in the outer court, uh, things start out bigger and more symmetrical. The copper altar or brazen altar, as it's often called, the mizbeach, the copper of burnt offering, or the altar of burnt offering, is 3 cubits high by 5 cubits by 5 cubits, and they went up to this thing on a ramp, but it's 5 by 5. It's a square, and it's pretty big. The further you go in all the way, of course, the next thing is round, the copper laver that we'll maybe get to later on in the future, hopefully. And then the other furniture, the menorah is sort of an anomaly a little bit, but it, in my view, as well as the copper laver, are going to relate to pi, as in pi or square. Many of these other things, such as the copper altar, and going all the way into the Ark of the Covenant, the thing sitting in the Holy of Holies, is more rectangular and smaller. And so I think that that's pretty interesting, as you get toward the more holy, set apart things, that the metals are more pure, and it's smaller. And I think about, we were talking about creating a sacred space of in a sacred space time thing, and I remember in the other video I talked about how the connection with a lot of the words associated with time and space, and the overlap of that, like a word like olam that can be translated as king of the universe, Melech Olam. But olam often is translated as something like forever or everlasting, but it's also translated as like world. Same in the Greek with aeon. that can be like translated as world or everlasting or forever and that sort of thing too. We have commandments of that say to honor my sanctuary and guard my Sabbaths. And so you have coupled together this idea of time and space. And, it was Einstein that coined that term, space time. And so when you think about this and you think about as much as we can the nature of God, and that's a hard thing to even get started on, especially this late in the video. But because I think it's important, and sometime maybe we can get into it. This scaling down process that really sorts of has to be discussed, because the fullness of God didn't dwell in the tabernacle. I mean, there he has to scale himself down in his power, in his effect on things, so that he doesn't, completely burn up people in the earth and everything. So it's very measured, but this technology of the tabernacle helps to bring all of that about, and makes everything, this communication device, work effectively, if everything is being done like it should. But it's interesting when we talk about space time, and that sort of thing, that as something moves toward the speed of light, like a car, if somehow we can imagine that we measure a vehicle and we measure it and it's 15 feet long, stationary, and then somebody gets in the vehicle and drives it down the street, and somehow we're able to just stop it immediately and get out and measure the vehicle, now that it will be much longer. The actual shape, the form of the thing will change as it gets toward the speed of light.
That's interesting.
So it's going to become more, so a square thing
Right.
moving toward
Yep.
the speed of light would become rectangular.
Right.
And that is part of my point there.
Yeah.
There's so much we just have run out of time on being able to get to. Maybe we can finish up with this, of talking of kind of going back to the beginning here, of how did the Israelites accumulate these things that they are going to then be able to give this offering, so that the artisans, which is an interesting thing too, artists, the effect that artists have on the world, and are in many ways the catalyst to it's the artist that created the space-time for God to interact with his people, using the materials and using the wisdom, understanding, knowledge that he gave. But ultimately, when we look at this stuff, they accumulated all of these treasures from Egypt when they spoiled Egypt when they were coming out. And God gave them that victory, and he told them to do it, to borrow all of these things, and basically they spoiled Egypt. Yeah. And but when you sometimes when you think more in terms of in synonyms, or maybe putting things in different ways, it has the power to transform the way we think it. When we take it out of the predictable biblical narrative to some, and you say, well, what's another way to say that they used the materials that they brought out of Egypt with them to make this space-time place for God. Another way to state that is that the people of God obtain valuables in their past life, their former life, not to get into reincarnation or anything, but I mean just your past.
Yeah.
There are valuables in things that you might not even know or recognize, or might be tempted to think that God can't use those things because it came from a time that maybe you were pretty far away from God in sin and in darkness, that you were a slave in Egypt and building Pharaoh's cities and this sort of thing. But A lot of those things God can use, and He can melt down those metals in different things and transform
Yeah.
those things into a means for interacting with Him
Right. Absolutely.
and
Very
helping
powerful.
others too.
Well, powerful message.
Well, great. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Be sure to like and subscribe and all that stuff. Hope to see you again soon. Take care.